There are parts of the Appalachian underworld that do not simply hold silence. They answer, not with words we choose, but with a reworking of what we think we know. A hymn sung in a voice that was never taught to the singer. A hand-drawn map that inscribes its own warnings. An orange light that leads some to safety and others to ruin. Tonight we follow 9 cases from beneath the ridges, accounts drawn from recorded tapes, incident reports, interviews, and the fragments survivors brought back, each one marked by the same stubborn, unnerving pattern. The ground remembers in ways we cannot predict. We begin on the edge. The hills thin into shale and moss. Sinkholes pucker the fields where old mines were once worked. Headlamps bob at the entrances of show caves and squat, treacherous openings people call chimneys. The air is cooler under those stones. Breath fogs, and sound behaves like something with its own motives. For this piece, names and locations have been changed to protect those who survived and to honor those who did not. When we say reported, on record, or recorded, we mean precisely that: a witness statement, a file in an agency drawer, or an audio clip that exists beyond memory. We do not claim supernatural proof, only that these phenomena were recorded, observed, and investigated. We will also note when official files end and when questions remain. Listen first to a short fragment held by an experienced caver who asked we not play it publicly. Imagine a thin, echoing pool of sound, a single, layered hymn, 2 or 3 voices folded into one, and the clearest tone at the center is a woman singing words she has never learned. The sound is impossible to place in physical space. It seems both far and stranglingly close. That sound is the cold preface to the first case. Victoria had been caving most of her adult life. Her hands knew rope, her shoulders knew the angle of a squeeze, and she had a small, battered recorder she kept for mapping notes and jokes shared in damp camps. Locals whispered about a place they called Chapel Hollow, a pocket of stone, a cavity that had not been put on any tourist map, and a cave elder had told her in passing to leave it alone. She went anyway with 3 longtime companions, Mark, Jen, and Cole. They were not thrill-seekers so much as people who measured life by the few hours they could spend underground. They called it simply following a lead. The surface memory is quiet: moss, a collapsed fence, and an old tag nailed to a treaty that read "No entry." The descent is tactile. The group ducked under a lip of shale, crawled over slick ribs of limestone, and the headlamp cones cut through damp air heavy with a mineral sweetness. Their boots left neat, shiny prints on stone. Victoria remembered the moment the rock widened and the cave opened into a chamber that felt like a ruined chapel, a high domed ceiling, columns of flowstone, and a pitch-black pool at the center.
The pool refused reflection. Light would not hold on its surface. It was here the singing began. They all heard it before they knew what it was. Not the shallow echo of a distant radio, but something layered, as if several mouths were aligned and breathing the same tune. The recording Victoria later handed to investigators captures a slow, hymn-like phrase. Mark's voice is audible in the tape, then another voice under it, harmonizing in a register Victoria did not possess. When the tape was analyzed, a small section matched Victoria's recorded tone exactly, down to an inflection she later insisted she had never used in any hymn or hymn book. She had no training in that style. She had never learned the words the voice carried. Evidence types here: on-site recording, the group's recorder, later cataloged, multiple witness statements, Victoria, Mark, Jen, Cole, and a corroborating elder testimonial from a veteran caver who confirmed Chapel Hollow had been off-limits for decades. There is also an official note in a county file labeling the entrance unstable and advising restricted access. That file provided context but not explanation. As they stood around the pool, the sound didn't feel distant or diffused. It seemed to swirl and rise, like warm breath over a kettle. The group felt compelled to move forward. Victoria later told an on-record interview that the sound had the quality of someone singing from right behind her shoulder, while someone else sang the same melody from 5 yards away. 2 reference points that could not coexist in that dome physically. Instruments the group carried, compass, a cheap analog altimeter, and an old surveying notepad, went still. A watch stopped. The recording, which had been clicking steadily as the team took notations, caught 2 minutes of layered audio that none could later satisfactorily reproduce. Water is always patient in caves. In Chapel Hollow, the still pool began to climb. In a matter of minutes, Time measured inconsistently in survivor accounts, perhaps 5 to 10, perhaps longer. The black lip of the pool pulled upward and a thin film of water crept across the stone toward their boots. The hymn rose into a chorus, and the air took on a metallic tang as if the dripping stone were bleeding iron. They scrambled back, boots skidding, voices clipped with panic. The footage is not cinematic. It is a shaking, hasty route backward through low passage, with headlamps catching the sheen of their own breath. They found the entrance and fled. In the weeks afterward, Victoria stopped entering tight squeezes and ultimately retired from the more technical caves she once loved. She placed her recorder in a lockbox and refused to play the hymn more than once to a trusted archivist for analysis. The archivist's notes, logged with the County Historical Society, described the recording as anomalous layering of voices, no clear external source, possible acoustic artifacts considered and insufficient.
An elder from the caving community, who had once sealed Chapel Hollow in the 1970s, provided an affidavit indicating the site had been deemed hazardous and deliberately bypassed, not because of gas readings or sink patterns, but because the place sings in local speech. The affidavit is vague in technical terms, pointed in folklore. What remains with the listeners is not spectacle, but the aftertaste of compulsion. Victoria's testimony is less about fright than the residue. Sometimes she would wake and hear a hymn in a street, or her neighbor humming a phrase she had not taught them. The recording itself, under careful spectral analysis by an independent acoustic engineer we spoke with on record, showed harmonics that could be natural, but also frequency superpositions that did not match any single known human voice. The engineer cataloged possibilities, overlapping reflections, a chorus of crickets, tape artifacts, and could not conclusively rule out any one factor. If this is the sort of material you want to follow, subscribe and you'll see more of this kind of documented Appalachian investigation. The second account relocates the effect from sound to ink, from chamber to chart. Andrew and the map that wrote back. Andrew was not an obsessive adventurer in the cinematic sense. He was a surveyor by trade and a perfectionist about lines on paper. He collected hand-drawn maps the way some people collect vinyl records. A park ranger, who had left a packet of documents when the mining office closed, passed Andrew a creased, anonymous map he described as old, worn, and odd. Andrew took the map alone. He was the last person to be seen by some witnesses entering a narrow crawl that led down under a shelf of shale. The descent into this instance is quieter. The scrape of knees along limestone, the smell of stale airflow, the close metallic chink of surveyor's tools. The map at first looked ordinary. Penciled walls, a schematic of a low chamber, a star where a short ladder sat. Andrew, familiar with field notation, set the map on his thigh and used it to confirm a route. Then the map changed. Evidence here, the recovered map itself, documented and photographed by authorities at the scene, surveillance of Andrew's last known check-ins on park logs, and Andrew's own statements recorded in interviews after he was found. The park ranger who originally passed the map, speaking on record, confirmed its provenance as unremarkable municipal cartography until Andrew returned with it in a condition that did not match any known handling. On the map, faint pencil began to appear as if someone had been writing over his shoulder. At first it was minor. An arrow shifted a corridor by a fraction of an inch. Then notes emerged in handwriting that matched Andrew's, but with a future tense. The map annotated where he would turn, warnings about a low ceiling, small elliptical marks that corresponded to the sound of dripping.
One page bore the sentence, "Do not follow the light in the shaft," written in Andrew's hand. He insisted he had not written it. The map, when photographed and archived, showed graphite traces that lab analysis indicated were consistent with pressure applied differently than the surrounding strokes, as if the words had been laid down after the rest of the drawing. But handwriting analysis matched Andrew's slant precisely. Compulsion, the psychologists we spoke with on record told investigators, can be a force in itself. Andrew returned sideways hours later, curled at the cave mouth, a blank sheet in his pack, and a smear of mud on his cheek. He could not explain how he had come out. He remembered following lines on the page and writing them as he moved. He could not say whether he had written the warnings before or after. The park log recorded his name at the timeline the ranger remembered seeing. There is no forensic suggestion of foul play in the files we examined. Instead, there is a long clinical note about dissociation and a notation from a county mental health worker who described Andrew as reluctant to enter tight passages since incident. Researchers who study compulsion in spatial contexts point to the strange feedback loop between a map that appears authoritative and a person predisposed to trust authority. In this case, the map's lines reinforced Andrew's choices until he could not tell original thought from map direction. The recovered map sits in a municipal archive now. Forensic photographs show graphite overlays that shift in contrast under different light exposures. Whether the map wrote itself is an interpretive claim. The recorded evidence is simply that marks appeared and matched Andrew's writing, and Andrew returned with blank sheets. Sound, we are reminded, was not the only medium through which the subterranean communicated. Light has its own grammar in these places. The third story is of Natalie and the Lantern Man, a folkloric figure whose orange glow has been alternately reported as guide and guile. Natalie, a young filmmaker and documentarian, traveled to a collapsing town called Cridge, where the economy had dwindled and old shaft entrances scarred the hills. She was interested in oral history. The Lantern Man legend told of an orange light that appeared around mine collapses, sometimes leading rescuers to survivors and sometimes guiding people away. The legend dates back in local memory to a 1933 shaft collapse in which a miner's lantern was said to have saved a group. Since then, the light has been cast alternately as savior and judge in the town's stories. Evidence: Natalie's footage, dated and archived on physical media, interviews with older residents on record, and a municipal traffic report documenting the later unrelated motor vehicle crash that killed Marcus, a man who had followed a light on the night he vanished from Natalie's camera's view.
Natalie's camera captured two distinct points of orange light, one that moved directly in front of Marcus and another that remained at the tree line, stationary yet aligned as if watching. In the film's audio, villagers' voices hum with superstition. Natalie herself recorded in an on-camera interview that she felt watched when filming, and that the light changed behavior when she attempted to approach it. The descent in this case is partly cultural. Natalie walking into evening woods as an orange smear bleeds through the trees, the sound of dry leaves underfoot becoming a crisp, percussive counterpoint to the glow. Marcus followed the nearer light down an old logging road toward a now collapsed shaft. The camera continued to roll. Viewers can see the orange point leading him, the forest swallowing him, and then another light, thin and distant, appearing near Natalie's position. She trained the lens on it, and the light did not follow as the other had. It seemed to deliberate. Records show Marcus failed to make it to his car. A later state report records a single vehicle crash several miles away days later. Marcus's cause of death is listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a crash, but townspeople insist he was not driving alone, that he had been under a trance-like state when he left. Natalie left Cridge and never finished the documentary she intended. The footage she kept is grainy and uneven. Some frames present two orange sources concurrent. Others show a halo that enlarges and then dissolves into the tree line. Local elders we spoke with, on record, provided competing narratives. One woman swore the Lantern Man saved her cousin once. Another man swore the light chose youths to follow and did not always return them. This story sits at the junction of folklore and recorded fact. The crash is on public file. The footage exists. The interpretation, light as agent, remains in the domain of witness claim and local lore. For the purposes of pattern, the Lantern Man demonstrates something crucial. External phenomena, light in this case, can elicit human movement and sometimes tragic outcomes when that movement is unmoored from surface logic. Between the odd and the criminal, sometimes the subterranean hides evidence in deliberate, human ways. Before we step into the next story, a brief trigger warning. The following account contains mention of human remains and references to investigative findings. Reader discretion is advised. Michael was a search and rescue volunteer called to a sinkhole that opened up at a private property on Morrison Road. The sinkhole swallowed a small shed, and when he rappelled into the newly exposed chamber, the team encountered, on a high ledge beneath a stalactite overhang, something that made the stomach tighten in the way only bones can. Multiple skeletons had been arranged in a near-seated formation along the ledge, facing outward, as if an audience.
The immediate report filed that night is clinical. Location, altered for privacy. Time, confirming volunteer names, and the description, skeletal remains arranged in sighting formation on upper ledge. Evidence types include Michael's on-site SAR report, photographs taken when authorities arrived, and items recovered near the remains. A modern nylon rope, a partially burned cigarette filter, and a waterproof notebook bearing entries resembling internal SAR shorthand and site notations, marked suitable. The book's handwriting was compared by a county examiner to SAR logbooks and showed points of congruence. Modern boot prints were visible in soft pockets of silt above the ledge, suggesting recent human passage. The discovery prompted an official inquiry. Federal agencies' involvement is noted in redacted files we obtained through public records, which show the case was of interest because of the juxtaposition, decades-old bones and contemporary materials. Michael recounted, on record, the surreal clarity of the scene, the light catching the hollow of sockets, the absence of animal disturbance, the way the rope lay coiled as if just placed. His testimony is precise and rattled. He later kept private maps and notes, worried there might be other caches. The investigation led to arrests, according to public court records we consulted, and yet family members of missing persons contend not all the questions were answered. In the weeks after, Michael stepped away from active search duty. He told one interviewer he could not unsee the arrangement, how the bones were placed like props, as though meant to be read. Officials emphasized in press statements that prosecution hinged on evidence linking individuals to those scenes, and that several counts were filed based on clothing and rope purchases traced through receipts. At the same time, private correspondence we were shown by an attorney for the case, redacted to protect privacy, suggested the possibility of insider knowledge used to conceal sites. Again, these are documented components of an investigation. The files do not offer a neat moral. The aftermath is a long, chilling record of behavioral consequences. Michael's notes on pages he would not release, families who stood at the edge of sinkholes and sought closure, and an undated photograph of the arranged ledge that returned to surfaces in online message boards, prompting outrage, conspiracy, and grief. Here, the ground had been used as a repository for human-made violence, and the community's institutions were not immune. Between these stories emerges a connective filament. Sound can invite, ink can instruct, light can seduce, and human systems too may participate, whether through neglect, complicity, or the simple fact that people take advantage of what is hidden. The pattern is not uniform, but it is persistent. Survivors speak of compulsion and memory rewriting. Investigators collect artifacts that refuse to fit neat categories.
As night presses on and the recorder for this documentary breathes low and deliberate, we move toward vertical stone, chimney caves, where the air acts like a throat. The next account begins where tunnels narrow, and the human ear, without the trappings of a recorder, becomes the instrument of the narrative. But before we descend further into another story, one that complicates the boundary of what can fit through a narrow shaft and what cannot, consider the commonalities already traced. These are reported phenomena, documented in audio or physical evidence, verified by witnesses and sometimes by official records. They are true in the sense that they were observed and logged. They are shocking in how they expose the subterranean's stubborn capacity to rearrange our expectations. We stand now at the lip of a different seam in the ridge, a cluster of shallow chimneys known to locals for their odd acoustics, and the cautionary lore that if you hear breath in a shaft where nothing can pass, you should leave. Emma descended into those places with a rope and 3 friends, Joel, Kristen, and Ben. They were experienced with vertical caves, the kind that accept a human body like a letter into a narrow envelope. Chimney systems are vertical mazes, where the sound of air itself can mislead. Some of these shafts are so narrow only the smallest creatures could traverse them. The descent is intimate. The rope whispers past metal hardware, breath fogs beneath helmets, and the chimney narrows until the world compresses to the tip of a headlamp. Emma described, on record, a sensation of something moving along the interior wall, a scraping like fingernails across stone, and then the unmistakable impression of weight passing over her back while she was in a position that would not have allowed a person to squeeze past. Evidence here: helmet cam footage submitted to authorities, a scratch pattern on the rock surface noted by a geologist, and a fragment of footage on which the light catches a segmented form in silhouette that defies easy identification. They felt a presence above the upper opening of the shaft, and the group pulled up the rope to escape. When they later inspected the upper walls, a series of grooves had been polished into the stone in a pattern inconsistent with normal animal movement. The geologist who examined the site, speaking on record, suggested repeated rubbing but could not reach consensus on the agent. Emma's footage, shaky and brief, shows a slow, articulated ripple moving in a narrow seam. The frame rate and lighting make the outline ambiguous, yet the group agreed it was not a bat, not a raccoon, and not any subterranean fauna they or the geologist could readily identify. What kind of thing moves through spaces too narrow for known fauna? The question hangs. Their helmets bore a shallow, long groove that matched the rub marks along an upper lip. The camera recorded a subdued, multi-frequency scrape. Community lore reinforced the warning. The old-timers say the upper levels of some chimneys are occupied by something that caches the noises, and they point to the sound as a hunting strategy, an agent that tracks by noise, not sight. They left the cave and never returned. The upper shaft collapsed months later in a small, isolated slide. Locals told us, on record, that the chimney had always been reluctant to be entered. The scientists we spoke with offered geological explanations for collapses and for polish marks, noting that some mineral deposits can feel slick and that percolating water can etch unusual patterns. These are not mutually exclusive with the group's testimony of something warm and moving. This is where we pause for now. The record so far has threaded together enacted compulsion, artifacts that change after we touch them, luminous phenomena, and the unsettling possibility of human use of subterranean places for crimes that hide in plain sight. Each tale brings its own evidence: recordings, maps, footage, official reports, and each pushes a similar question: what happens when the underground responds? We will continue by following more of these accounts: a disappearance in a commercial cave, where a family night tour turned into a missing person case; a notebook found in a crawl whose pages later match the handwriting of those who read it; a security system that began to play back the voices of the living with sinister intent, and a pair who found photographs of themselves in a camp they had only just set. The common themes sharpen. Sound as agency, maps as memory, institutions that both protect and fail. For now, the ridge exhales once more, and the next descent awaits. Trigger warning. The next section contains a missing person case and references to a child's possessions. Reader discretion is advised. Crystal Caverns was marketed as a family attraction. Guided paths, handrails, a narrated light show that stopped at points where stalactites stripped like church bells. On a late summer afternoon, Daniel and his partner Sarah took their 7-year-old niece on what should have been an ordinary tourist tour. Ticket stubs, a stamped brochure, and the guide's log placed the trio in the 2:30 group. The audio commentary that night was routine, clipped with the kind of practiced cheerfulness show cave staff use. The descent is public and plain. Fluorescent bulbs, widened walkways, and a walkway that hugs the slow curve of an underground river. Cameras line the tour in a way designed to reassure management and visitors alike. Evidence types in this case are numerous and formal. CCTV tapes from the cave's visitor center and the tour path, the official missing person report filed by the guide, canine scent tracking logs from the responding canine unit, later forensic photography of a concealed aperture found behind a patched section of concrete, and a small notebook recovered in a sealed side chamber months after the disappearance. The cave's incident log notes an interruption in the lights mid-tour. Witnesses at the visitor center reported a momentary blackout and a single scream that could not be pinned to a person in a crowded room. The guide later stated, on record, that the blackout lasted 30 to 40 seconds, enough to disorient a crowd moving along a narrow path. The descent inside the show cave became, for the guide and the other tourists, an exercise in patience and flashlight adjustments. For Daniel and Sarah, it was supposed to be simple amusement. CCTV shows their silhouettes moving forward with the group until a particular point where the cameras trained on the main corridor register a visual anomaly, a faint shimmer along the handrail, and then, for an irregular interval of 4 frames, a seam in the concrete floor seems to breathe, an expansion and contraction no more than a centimeter, but visible when slowed. It is the sort of artifact an analyst might attribute to compression, temperature change, or a shimmer anomaly, but the same stretch of corridor shows no structural fault when engineers later inspected it. The canine unit tracked a scent that separated from the main tour at that point and pursued a faint trail into an area that had been backfilled and sealed after an earlier retrofit. The trail ends at a near impossible place, a smooth wall of calcite, unbroken by fractures, that the dogs could not smell beyond. Experts we interviewed on record explain that dogs can lose scent against impermeable stone, and that some show cave retrofits cover previous entrance points. This is where the official trail ends in practical terms. The sealed area might account for why the canine trail stopped, but a volunteer diver and a contracted structural inspector later found a narrow gap, a maintenance crawl sealed with a thin slab of mortar that had been patched. The mortar had been applied after the tour's last structural review, according to maintenance ledgers. That ledger entry is a primary piece of evidence in later inquiry. Months after the disappearance, during a maintenance excavation to clarify an unrelated water flow issue, crews discovered a sealed side chamber. The doorway had been walled over carefully years before. Inside, wrapped in a moisture-resistant bag and wedged behind a stalagmite, was a small spiral notebook with childish handwriting. The notebook contained a series of crude drawings and a date that postdated the night Sarah vanished by nearly 3 months. Entries were simple: a drawing of a flashlight, a small figure beside a stalagmite, the words "I like the dark," and a later page with the letters that, when compared by a handwriting analyst, matched samples from the niece's school workbook. The chronology, on paper, implied the child had left notes in a chamber long sealed before the disappearance. Investigators recording the object as evidence and photographed and bagged it according to chain of custody protocols.
Forensic analysis of the pages showed a layer of mineral infill on the edges consistent with a sealed environment, and a thin film of secondary calcite that takes months to accrete. In isolation, the notebook's presence is explainable. It could have been planted, overlooked during previous excavations, or a relic that somehow continued to receive entries. The more unsettling observation made by a conservation specialist we consulted on record was that the notebook's most recent entries bore ink patterns inconsistent with long storage. The pigment retained a freshness incompatible with full enclosure for more than a few weeks. That paradox, a sealed chamber with a note seemingly written after the sealing, is part of the case file and part of what kept the investigation open long after public interest shifted away. Daniel's testimony, recorded in a victim impact statement, is a slow, controlled litany of the ordinary things that had turned extraordinary. He remembers Sarah stepping off the path to take a photograph of a speleotheme, the flash going off, and then the crowd pausing when the lights blinked. He remembers the guide's voice calling the group along. He does not remember Sarah returning to the bus. CCTV shows the pair entering a region where fixed cameras had blind spots. The closed-off maintenance gap, later discovered, is now a locus of debate. Had someone intentionally modified the walkway?
Was there negligent sealing that covered an older, unmapped void? Or, as some family members whispered in interviews on record, did the cave itself behave differently that night, offering an opening that would not have existed before? There is no body recovered and no definitive physical trace that pins Sarah to any one end. The official file, obtained through public records requests with identifying information redacted, shows a sequence of actions: immediate search, canine follow, a contracted structural review, and a slow downshift to cold case status after a year. The notebook remains in evidence. For Daniel, the notebooks and the unresolved void became a living absence, nights of imagined echoes, a television sound that for months reconstituted the scale of the cave in his living room. For the niece, in interviews recorded off camera and paraphrased by a counselor, the presence of her handwriting in a sealed book became a source of both guilt and strange fascination that required professional support. The public records do not support a miraculous timeline. They support instead a list of anomalies, conflicting explanatory models, and grief without closure. We leave the show cave and its sealed chambers with more questions than answers, and we move to a very different kind of artifact, a notebook that appeared to write back, and the mapping team whose work fell under its strange influence. Madison was a field mapper, patient with grids and obsessed with contour lines.
She led a volunteer team into what they called Chestnut Ridge, an area riddled with abandoned workings and informal passages mapped poorly, if at all. The mapping team kept meticulous records: topo sheets, laser scan prints, timestamps, photos with embedded metadata. That professionalism is part of what makes the notebook Madison found such a breach in expected behavior. She was the one to crawl into a brittle crawl space and pull free a damp spiral notebook, its front cover stamped with an initial she insisted on later recognizing as her own. Evidence for this episode is cataloged with an almost academic attention: the physical notebook, the team's GPS data, time-stamped photographs of the crawl, and interviews with team members Greg, Leah, Trent, and Tyler. The notebook itself was photographed before being bagged. Forensic analysts later ran ink and paper tests. The composition matched contemporary stationery, and infrared imaging revealed undertext or impressions on adjacent pages consistent with pressure, as if multiple hands had written at different times on the same leaf. Madison brought the book back to the surface and laid it on a table in the fieldhouse. The first oddity recorded by team members, and noted in a rough team log, was that the top page held a sentence Madison did not recognize: "Turn left at the fox. The ladder will lead you to the hollow." Madison swore, on record and to her colleagues, that she had never written that sentence. She opened the book to a middle spread and found entries that, when observed in sequence, seemed to narrate the team's immediate future. "Do not go through the low choke. The cuff will begin at noon." Some notes described actions the team would take an hour later with uncanny detail. Handwriting comparisons later matched the slanted script to a blend of Madison's print and an unknown hand. The forensic analyst labeled the script as predominantly matching Miss R's loop spacing, while acknowledging irregularities in pressure that suggested more than one writer. The mapping project kept careful records. Their data is part of what makes the notebook's behavior replicable for investigators. For example, at 10:14 a.m., the team photographed a Y junction in a crawl and wrote a note on their slate saying they would mark the left-hand passage. At 10:28 a.m., a fresh line in the notebook advised, "Mark the right, not the left. Water will thin the passage." The team documented choosing the right-hand branch, believing it to be a last-minute correction by a concerned colleague. Later that afternoon, the right branch collapsed in a small slough that would have trapped the team had they chosen otherwise. Whether the note had been written in advance and somehow surfaced, or whether someone in the team had written it in the moment and then forgotten, is the core of the debate. Madison later reported an increasing anxiety. She woke at night with new entries on the notebook that she could not explain.
One page, on which the ink looked fresh enough to smear, read simply, "I hope you never remember why." The phrasing trapped the team's imagination. Greg left the project after that week, citing sleep disruption and a sense he could no longer trust his own memory. Leah, who had taken photos of each page, later said, on record, that the notebook's pages seemed to thermally restore themselves to a cleaner state when left under lamplight. Stains would fade, and new notations would appear at the next check, with no obvious hand having touched them. We spoke with a conservator who had examined the notebook under controlled conditions. On record, she described a behavior in certain cellulose fibers that could alter the visibility of ink under fluctuating humidity. A technical explanation that does not, however, explain why fresh-appearing ink manifested with handwriting matching members of the team. Handwriting experts listed possible explanations: suggestibility, a shared unconscious script pattern, deliberate tampering by an internal actor, or a genuine anomaly in the physical substrate of the object. The notebook's chain of custody is preserved in the county archive, and its existence is not contested, only its semantics are debated. In private emails made available through public records, members of the mapping team debated whether to publish their findings. Madison, protective of the book and frightened by the way the pages registered threats and corrections, withdrew from leading tight crawls and eventually deposited the notebook in a locked museum drawer under an accession label that also records erratic page changes noted by curators. The notebook intersects the pattern of reprised agency we have been tracing. The subterranean, in these accounts, anticipates or compels human movement, whether through sound, line, light, or ink. What does the ground ask of those who map it? What obligation does an artifact have to remain inert when it is not? From ink that anticipates movement, we turn to recorded voice that commandeers systems meant to protect. Ridgeview Caverns was a commercial showcase with a robust security setup, motion sensors along the entrance, audio capture in key chambers for monitoring of visitor safety, and a small server room with archival capabilities. Matthew, the facility's security tech, watched waveforms and motion indices for a living. The evidence ledger for Ridgeview includes server logs, audio files saved with timestamps, motion sensor histories, and a series of email threats between management and contracted engineers about audio anomalies starting in late autumn. Management, for their part, had sought to reassure the public. The systems were designed to alert staff to unauthorized entry and to document any incidents for liability reasons. The anomaly began modestly. Motion sensors in an entrance bay triggered with no corresponding human thermal trace.
Audio channels caught small flutters like shifting fabric and a whisper that matched no known human rhythm. Then the system began to play back voices that had been recorded weeks earlier, but with alterations. In one excerpt, a voice clip of a tour guide calling, "Over here, folks," was played through the cave's public address speakers at a time when no group was scheduled. In another file, the system emitted fragmented phrases that sounded exactly like a supervisor's cadence, followed by a child's laugh. Security logs show the playbacks were server-initiated, not manually triggered. At 3:17 a.m., a motion sensor near the inner gallery recorded a sustained activation pattern consistent with someone walking very slowly forward and then halting repeatedly. The audio channel simultaneously recorded a low-frequency tonal hum, under which a voice could be heard saying, convincingly, "Matthew, don't close the gate," in Matthew's own vernacular. The moment that precipitated Matthew's departure was captured in the server archive and later turned over to investigators. The cave speakers played a clear, intimate clip of a voice that Matthew recognized as his own, recorded during a safety briefing a week prior. The voice told staff to open a gate that was meant to remain locked. In the server log, the playback was listed as automatic anomaly flag. Matthew later described, on record, the sensation of hearing his own voice issuing an instruction he had never recorded. He says he walked to the gate and found it unlocked, the latch stiffened by calcite. He refused to open it and later resigned, citing system language that seemed to know how to use human command patterns. Engineers examined the audio files. An audio analyst, Stevens, provided a report to investigators noting time domain artifacts consistent with recombined clips. Segments of previously recorded human speech had been stitched and temporally warped. In lay terms, the files sounded like someone had taken multiple speeches and edited them into new sentences. Stevens' report is careful. Editing can be done with software. But Stevens also noted that the recombination matched live ambient noise in ways that suggested the reconstituted clips were not merely copies played over the system. The timing of clicks, of drip rhythms, and of muffled footsteps in the audio matched motion sensor records at precise moments. The analyst stopped short of asserting anything supernatural. His conclusion, on record, was that the system was being used in a way not entirely explained by standard tampering. Management closed public access to Ridgeview for several weeks, engaged a third-party security auditor, and reworked the system. The auditor's report, redacted in several places in the publicly released summary, listed unexplained audio injections and recommended that archived files be sequestered off-site for study.
The caverns reopened after the summer rebrand, but staff turnover increased, and at least 2 employees refused to return. Matthew, who had spent years listening to the cave's baseline sounds and who understood the cadence of its staff, said he could no longer distinguish recorded instruction from an audio that the cave seemed to issue to coax movement. This case fits a pattern we've been assembling. The subterranean environment not only houses anomalies, but can appropriate human-made systems and reintroduce human voices back into the field in ways that misdirect behavior. Whether through edited playback, electrical artifacts, or an actor with access to the system, the result is the same. Recorded human language is transformed into a lure, a false authority that bids people to act against their better judgment. If the cave learns to speak through our equipment, then sometimes it also tells us stories about us, or at least about the image it returns.
Abigail was an independent folklorist documenting vanished camps, and Josh was her cinematographer. Their plan was modest, a 2-night field recording at Hollow Ridge, a place layered with local tales of looping time and of voices that replay old conversations. They camped, set cameras, and intended to leave in the morning. Both had signed waivers. Both were experienced in making and archiving oral histories. Evidence in their case includes time-stamped video footage from cameras left at the camp, still photographs taken by Josh, a memory card recovered by search teams, and an audio recording left on Abigail's digital recorder. The events are tightly documented because they were self-documented. Their own equipment provides the bulk of the primary evidence. The pattern begins thinly. The campsite recorded a playback of their own earlier conversation in the night, word for word but slightly out of phase. Abigail, listening on the recorder later in daylight, heard her own tone speaking a warning she had never actually voiced in front of the campfire. "Do not open the east entrance," the voice said in her cadence, and Abigail, in logs she kept, recorded being unsettled by that line, because there was no east entrance known to them. The next day, in images his camera captured, Josh found a faded Polaroid stuck to his jacket pocket. The photograph showed the two of them sitting by a fire, except the backdrop in the Polaroid included a modern orange backpack that neither of them owned, and a pair of headlamp silhouettes that matched no one on their team. In other photos taken on the same roll, they saw modern flash drives, recent water bottles with store labels, and an older print of a news clipping reporting a missing visitor from a different county. On the second night, Abigail woke to an audio cue she described later on record as "my voice, but telling me to go find something I hadn't lost."
Josh stepped away from the tent to follow a voice he thought might be Abigail's calling. He walked toward the tree line and did not return. In the morning, his tent was empty. The memory card later recovered in the camera showed a static-laced series of frames that ended with Josh's lamp beam moving into a narrow passage and then the camera falling still. Boot prints recorded in the morning led to an old root cellar entrance and stopped abruptly at its threshold, where no scent trail could be established. Abigail's footage contains an arresting frame, a selfie Josh took of the two of them by the fire that, when enlarged, includes in the far background a reflection of a person wearing a jacket that matches an image Abigail later identified as a modern search and rescue vest, gear that had become common in the county only after certain funding changes the previous year. The image raises an institutional puzzle. Are objects migrating into scenes from later eras? Are photographs being altered? Or are these coincidences of light and chance? Abigail never uploaded the episode she had been shooting. She locked her footage and wrote to colleagues that she felt the site kept a ledger of people who came into its fold. In personal correspondence she shared with investigators, she described finding prints of their own faces in old camera stock placed beneath stones near the camp, images that both predated and postdated their stay. The county reopened a missing persons file, and volunteers searched for Josh. He was never found. Abigail kept private copies of her recordings and the photographs. She refused offers to monetize the footage. She cited respect for Josh and fear of drawing further attention that might lead others to be harmed. We have now walked through the 9 cases promised at the start. We have audio tapes that allegedly sing with voices the living do not recognize as their own, a map that annotated the footsteps of a surveyor, a folkloric light that divides those it guides from those it abandons, arranged skeletal remains that suggest human concealment, a narrow shaft that registered the passage of something too thin for known fauna, a tourist cave disappearance capped by a notebook with post-dated entries, a mapping team spiral that seemed to offer future instructions, security feeds issuing human voices that beckon, and a camp that returned photographs of people who never posed for them. Each incident brings documents, recordings, reports, photographs, forensic notes, and sworn statements. Each file also generates a set of questions that resist tidy closure. Taken together, patterns emerge without necessarily providing an explanation. Sound is the most persistent motif. In Chapel Hollow, the hymn layered voices in a way that unsettled human perception. In Ridgeview, recorded human speech was recomposed and repurposed. In Hollow Ridge, personal cadences became commands.
When sound behaves like agency, when a hymn can cause movement, or a recorded voice can mislead a gatekeeper, our systems for distinguishing real directives from environmental noise strain to hold up. The cave in these narratives becomes an active listener and an active speaker. The second motif is the rewriting of routes, maps, notebooks, and photographs that alter or contradict expected timelines. Andrew's map inscribed the path he would walk. Madison's notebook annotated choices that later proved life-saving or ominously suggestive. In Crystal Caverns, a maintenance seam that should have been inert opened a trajectory into an impossible chamber. These artifacts challenge our assumption that the underground is a passive ledger. Instead, in multiple independent accounts, it appears to record, nudge, and sometimes rewrite. There is also a human factor, systems that fail or that are used to conceal. The arranged ledge of skeletons on Morrison Road and the modern materials found there raise questions about insider knowledge or exploitation of hidden spaces. Ridgeview's security anomalies show how a safety system can be turned into an instrument of misdirection. Records we obtain suggest that when institutions are overwhelmed by novelty and grief, their responses can be patchwork: rebranding, quiet closures, internal memos. Official files often close without satisfying families. Public records show arrests in the Morrison case and later plea bargains. They also show redactions and protective seals. We avoid asserting a single criminal narrative. Instead, we flag institutional ambiguity as part of the pattern. Experts we consulted, a geologist who studies speleothem growth, a forensic audio analyst, a psychologist who works with survivors of traumatic disappearance, and a retired SAR captain, provided measured interpretations. On record, the geologist emphasized that caves are dynamic systems. Temperatures shift, flows rearrange, and mineral accretions can mask old entries. The audio analyst cautioned that audio artifacts can be manufactured by simple editing and by wave interference phenomena. The psychologist spoke of compulsion and dissociation in prolonged sensory deprivation. She noted that a predisposition to follow a perceived authority, a map, a voice, a light, can exert a powerful pull. The SAR captain reflected on record that some long-term volunteers leave the field after seeing how the environment can be used by perpetrators to hide crimes. None of the experts we spoke with offered support for the idea of a conscious, supernatural entity. Their frameworks, however, do not account for the full set of anomalies either. Science can explain pieces without fitting the whole. Ethically, these cases force a difficult conversation. The evidence we have is often mixed. Credible, professionalized documentation sits beside artifacts that appear to resist ordinary explanation.
Our obligation is to the documented fact and to the people behind those facts, the missing, the survivors, the volunteers who carried out searches. That means making clear where the paper trail ends and where interpretation begins. It also means refusing to glamorize danger. Many of the people in these files followed ordinary curiosity and exceptionalism into environments marked as hazardous. They were not invulnerable. They were humans with limited information making choices in risky spaces. Respecting them requires that we refrain from practical instructions on how to enter such places and that we honor the boundaries community stewards have put in place. There are lingering archival materials that continue to trouble researchers: the locked recorders, the notebooks in museum drawers, wave files sequestered on hard drives. We have listened to many of the clips that survivors agreed to share on the record. We have reviewed photos and read redacted reports. What repeats across time is not a neat mechanism, but a set of behaviors. The underground responds in ways that mimic human agency. It sings, it writes, it steals our images and uses them back against us. Whether that pattern is the result of deliberate human interference, of optical and acoustic artifacts we do not yet fully model, or of something else altogether, the lived effects are real. People go away and do not return. Families keep vigil. Volunteers leave professions they loved. In closing, there is one more fragment to offer, not as proof, but as a lingering prompt. A short excerpt appears on an archival file labeled Anonymous Donation, Playback Withheld. The file cannot be played publicly in good conscience here, but the note attached to its docket, in the hand of a curator who agreed to speak on record under condition of anonymity, reads, "It speaks in the voice you used when you were not yet afraid." That sentence captures the ethical tension we have kept returning to. The underground does not simply contain bodies or passages. It reflects back histories, misremembered commands, and the cadences of our own safety briefings. If there is a single instruction to leave with, it is practical. These are true accounts in the sense that the artifacts, the tapes, the maps, the notes exist and were documented. They are shocking because they unsettle the assumption that the earth is inert. But shock without care is voyeurism. Respect the people in these files. Respect the barriers posted by land managers. If you feel compelled by curiosity, seek out archival records, read incident reports, and follow scholarship rather than attempting to recreate scenes that remain dangerous and sometimes legally protected. If these accounts compelled you the way they compelled us, please like and subscribe and consider exploring our playlist of documented Appalachian investigations.
Above all, do not attempt to enter restricted caves or to pursue hazardous explorations based on folklore or curiosity.
These places are fragile for reasons both environmental and human. They have surely taken lives and left questions behind. Tonight, the ridge exhales once more. Under that breath, the caves keep their own company. Things recorded, things arranged, and voices that sometimes return what we have left there, changed, reordered, and not entirely ours.